happy to welcome Russell Kacer from YK Communications. Russell, where are you coming to us from today?
I'm actually in El Campo, Texas, but the company is started and headquartered out of Ganado, Texas. The company was started in 1948. They ordered a white two-story wood frame house out of a Sears and Roebuck catalog that was delivered by rail. And the company was set up about 2 blocks from the rail station right there. And so my great-grandparents lived upstairs. The phone company was downstairs. And that's kind of how things started off.
Paint a picture of what Ganado was like back then.
Yeah, looking back at the photos there, I mean, there were obviously dirt roads going on still in a small town. Still to this day, Ganado only has a population of 2,000, and it was even smaller back then.
When you started in the business, what was your job?
So early 2000s, I worked all through high school as summer jobs, things like that. I remember typing up the old telephone directories, probably junior high, early high school, helping to answer phones and just kind of things in the office. But when I really came back in a full-time role was after I'd finished my bachelor's degree, and that would have been 2002. And so I came back, and I remember that was the days of, do we continue doing long distance by the minute? Do we start offering unlimited long distance? And really that was when we had gotten into the internet service provider space, and that was still dial-up at that point. And so, the rush of the secondary line, so everybody had that dedicated line for their dial-up internet connection. And, that was kind of some of what was going on in that day. Hey, we made it up to the 56K for dial-up internet. Do we give them unlimited, or do we keep it at 100 hours? Just those types of things. That's what was going on then. We started offering dial-up in the late 90s, 96, 97, somewhere in there.
So it was modem banks. It was, you dial into a modem bank, and the modem bank would take your twisted pair and turn it into a digital signal and route it. And, in those days, 56K was the most you were ever going to get out of that twisted pair, right? Because the typical twisted pair held 64 kilobits. Unless you bonded them together, and then you got the whopping 128 kilobits.
Right. I remember things from the business office where someone didn't dial in the right local dial-up line, and they started incurring all of the long distance charges with the dial-up internet that was going on. I remember that was hard for a lot of people to understand. But I remember as dial-up internet became more and more popular, you had to have those modem banks for that peak time.
Exactly.
Folks, it was that balance of, at first, businesses weren't really using it. It was kind of an evening fun thing. And then it shifted to where businesses relied on that. So you had to have enough modems to accept all those calls during the day for businesses, evening for entertainment. And it was that now where we look at overall network bandwidth. I remember in those days watching those modem banks fill up, and are we gonna have to start booting some people off? Should we continue to offer unlimited because they just connect and they don't disconnect? Those types of things.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of re-engineering done during those days. And for guys like me, we were selling equipment. I was selling equipment for then it was Lucent. It was a boom because we couldn't sell it fast enough.
Right.
So we were selling all the switching gear, all the modem banks. And what I remember a lot of the teleco engineers dealing with was the change in the busy hour, right? Because the teleco networks are built around shared access. And when all of a sudden you've got this peak traffic load at night, which is when people were getting on the internet, right? It just drove the engineering in the offices crazy, and it wound up driving the need for a lot of additional gear that we wound up selling. So it was a good news story for us on the equipment side.
I remember, guys, we bought Louise and Markham 2 additional exchanges in 1996, and they
Nice.
were part of the Verizon GTE breakup, and they left those 2 communities literally dying on the vine. There were pieces of the central office that were held together with paper clips and rubber bands, and I say that in complete honesty. But what was crazy to me is in 1996, we bought those 2 exchanges. There were still customers on party lines in 1996. And so one of the funny stories that we tell is we had one individual, and we'll just refer to her as Mrs. Smith. And Miss Smith called in and she said, I do not want to be taken off my party line. I do not want to be off my party line, knowing that she's listening to everything that the neighbors are saying. And so finally we told her, Miss Smith, we tell you what, we're going to leave you on the party line, but we're going to move all of your neighbors to individual access lines. And that's, she wasn't too happy about it, but here we are.
What were some of the challenges from the generation before you that you recall?
So, that's kind of a unique generation, in my opinion. You've got my mother and my uncle who grew up in the days of the telephone company was a monopoly. And, especially with the dial-up internet, you've got those second lines coming in. I mean, it's just a cash cow. The money's flowing in. And then it was also the day of let the consultants run the business. There was these large consulting firms that were kind of driving all of this. And all of a sudden, it's like, bam, there's threats to support mechanisms. Bam, there's competition coming in. All of these. And so it's kind of it really was a kind of a hands-off approach to management, which suddenly became a hands-on, boots on the ground. You need to know everything that's going on in your business from a competitive standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint. And so I think the biggest challenge there is that, it went from the second generation, our company with my grandfather Raymond was very hands-on. The third generation, Russ and my mother Paula were they're on a day-to-day basis, but there wasn't the in-depth management that has to happen like it's happening now.
A lot of the people that ran little phone companies weren't equipped to deal with it because they had essentially been on cruise control for many of them, and they didn't evolve. Now, several did. Many evolved, got into other lines of business. It sounds like you guys definitely did down there. You got into TV. You got into wireless. And those were the companies that thrived and did well, but so many sold out in those times because they weren't equipped to deal with the changes in the industry.
And you talk about, that's one of the things that I feel like I've seen in the industry kind of come full circle. You talk about that need for diversity. It was the telephone line forever, and that's all it was. And so then, this threat of competition. And so you've got to diversify. And, what's going to happen to support mechanisms? We've got to diversify. So you start doing TV, you do wireless, you do security, you do all these things. And then you reach a point that you're spread so thin as a provider in all of these areas. It's hard for me to find a technician that can install a phone line, who can also do a security system, who can also understand, the need for the broadband piece of it. And so in my time in the industry, I have seen this, what went from a singular service to a very expanded portfolio of services, which now has come down to a narrow kind of a level of expertise. Yeah, there are other things that we put on top of our service, but our main focus now is building that fiber network, building that rock solid, reliable network. And there's some additional things that we put on top of it, but there's a lot of things that we've let go, saying, you know what, there's not enough revenue coming from that. It's pulling too much focus or resources from our team. Drop that. Let's get lean and mean, and let's focus on what we do and do it well.
That's the thing about the small companies. The smaller companies were able to move fast. If you compare what you went through versus what, say, your peers at like Frontier or at, CenturyLink or, even, Quest, those guys were all very specialized. And those guys all had, management teams that had the company focused, and they were very driven in certain directions. I saw small companies do amazing things during that time. I saw small companies get into wireless service, get into triple play services, get into E911, get into security with a small team of engineers and technicians delivering it all. It was really fun and rewarding from my perspective in working with some of the small independents because you did cover so much ground.
We've got our first piece of fiber that we put in the late 80s that is still fully functional, still running, and everything's going great there. For us, I guess we've been dealing with fiber since the late 80s, but for us, the first time I feel like we really, really pushed fiber was, I guess it was the early 2000s when we did a fiber to the home deployment for the entire community of Ganado all at once. And so we took that opportunity at the same time. We retired every bit of our aerial infrastructure at that time. So one of the things that we did in that fiber to the home deployment in Ganado was retiring all aerial cable. And with our proximity to the Texas Gulf Coast, we are in Hurricane Alley, and so it's really important for us to have that network 100% underground. So we kind of killed two birds with that one stone. We're having to make those decisions. Do we drop back and look at maybe we do a wireless deployment for those furthest, pieces of the network? And it's so against everything that we've done as an independent telco to even consider maybe those locations are not serviceable anymore. And that that's like 4 generations of going against the grain. It's hard to even have those conversations, but there's conversations that we're having to have. As far as where I think the industry is at now, it's exciting to see what some of these independent telcos and co-ops are pulling off for these rural communities. I look at the funding that's falling from the sky, and it's one of those things that you see these providers that you've never heard of that are coming out of the woodwork trying to catch some of that money that's falling from the sky. And it's one of those things that as an industry, I feel this kind of banding together of, hey, we were country before country was cool. I mean, we were rural. We have been rural. We are rural. We understand rural more than anyone else. And, it was kind of eye-opening for me when I went to a luncheon a couple of weeks ago with one of our U.S. congressmen, our legislative leaders, that stood up in front of the group and started talking about 5G for rural. 5G is going to be the solution for rural. And I'm sitting in the back row going, no, it's not. And so I walked right up after that presentation. I walked right up to the chief of staff. I gave him my card and I said, I've been doing rural broadband since the 1940s. If you want to know how rural broadband is done, and if you want to know how rural broadband needs to be done, call me. I'm excited to see where it goes. I think that we're doing amazing things for our communities. And I've always been one of, I've had other friends in the industry over the years, and I remember family members that anytime there was a threat to a support mechanism, yeah, it's scary, and it's easy to point the finger, and they're the reason that we can't do this, and what are we going to do? I've always kind of been of the mindset of these are the cards that we're dealt, and let's play them. And we have always provided a service. We've always filled a need for our community. We will continue to do that no matter what that looks like. This is the main street in Ganado. That's my grandfather, Raymond Young, that's on the telephone pole there in the distance. And you see the aerial infrastructure running down kind of the main street of Ganado. This is my grandfather, Raymond Young. So he went off to Texas A&M and went to college for 3 years there and then got called out for World War II. He at that point went and he was stationed in the New York area. They got the call that the war had ended just as his crew was getting ready to head out overseas. And wow. He said one of his favorite stories that he always told over and over again was he'd come in and he'd say, "Did I ever tell you about the time that I buzzed the Empire State Building?" And it was when they found out the war was over and they weren't going to fly out, their captain let them go and take a little buzz around the city, and they actually buzzed the Empire State Building. And so that was kind of his big glory moment from the war. But after that, he came back. He finished at Texas A&M. He had 1 year after the war, and then he came back to work for the company then.
And it looks like he's outfitted to climb a pole. Is that right?
Absolutely. And so this is a man, I'll tell you guys, this is a man that walked on water for me. He, at age 80, on his 80th birthday, he climbed his last telephone pole.
Oh.
And he took his last flight in his World War II, and I don't know the exact model, but in his World War II plane that he purchased. He stepped off the plane, shed a tear or two, kissed the wing of that plane and hung it up. And it wasn't that he wasn't able to do that anymore. The insurance for being 80 years old and flying a plane was through the roof. So he retired from flying, and he went back to the office, climbed his last telephone pole, and that's how he celebrated his 80th birthday. These are Raymond's parents, Roy and Gertrude Young. So this is the original founders of Ganado Telephone Company. So you see them after a day of construction there with the Western Electric reel of cable, and then the house in the background is that two-story home where the office began. My grandmother, Jean, had 2 daughters, and her husband was killed in the war. And so she is now in her early 20s, a widow with 2 very young daughters. And to make ends meet, she gets a job at the switchboard at night. She sleeps on a cot, and when a call comes in, she comes and connects the calls in the middle of the night. So when my grandfather comes back, he asks his dad, "Hey, there's a dance in town. I need a date. Do you know anybody I could ask out for a date?" And his dad tells him, "Well, there's a little widow woman who's working the switchboard at night. Why don't you ask her out?" So they start dating. And one of the stories that we always like to tell as a family is, in that day and age, not everyone had a car. And so she walked every day from work to home and around town. And so she would be walking and she would hear someone whistle at her. And she finally learned to start looking up because it was my grandfather hanging from a telephone pole, whistling at her as she walked down the street. And so that's just one of those cute little stories in their little love story that happened through the telephone company. They later got married and then had my uncle Russ and my mother Paula. And that's the second and third generation of the company there.
Oh, what am I looking at here? This looks like not the switchboard anymore.
So this is when Ganado went to direct dial. And I don't know the year of this, but this photo was featured on the front of a Stromberg Carlson newsletter that went out to all telephone companies. And this is when Ganado went from the switchboard to direct dial. And so this is a picture of Raymond and Jean Young, the second generation of the company.
Pretty cool. What is Grandma? It looks like she has some kind of a tool in her hands. Dave, do you know what that might be, or am I seeing it wrong?
Well, these things were full of relays, right? So they were constantly. She might have like a little brush to clean the relays. These things made a lot of noise because they were constantly connecting, calls through the connecting relays, right? So they were quite the piece of equipment for sure.
And this one is the last one. I saved the best for last for I just think that's a great photo. So, Russell, what do you know about this photo?
This is Gertrude Young, so first generation, going up to inspect Raymond's work up on the pole, the second generation. So she herself was no stranger to a telephone pole and to rolling up her sleeves and getting her hands dirty in the network. Wow,
that's amazing. I love it.
I've got to choke back a couple of tears in some of those stories telling you guys, because it's just, I guess I picture myself as still a kid running around that office. And so when you take an opportunity to sit back and really go back and reflect to all those times, it's there's just so much history there. And it's one of the things, kind of a term that we've coined around YK is, we want to be a technology company. We want to offer the latest, greatest, and being on the cutting edge of technology. But at the same time, we want to pay homage to all of the generations of hard work and guts and grit that came before us. So we've kind of coined this term of a history of innovation. And that's something that we're really proud of at YK. We feel like we've got a history of innovation that, is something that we've built upon to be able to be that technology provider. And on top of that, just as far as community supporters, we started in the year 2000. Raymond and Royce and Paula, the second and third generations of the company, started something called the Young Family Foundation, which is our nonprofit arm of the company. And so we're proud we are just about to come up on the $2 million mark in high school scholarships that we've provided to these 4 small rural communities. So it's just one of those things that it's been ingrained in me from day one. Support the communities you serve. They take care of us. We take care of them. It's this partnership. And it's just, again, for myself, my brother, my cousin, my mom, all of us that are still there on a day-to-day basis, it's just something that we are incredibly proud of.